very small room, and she physically put me in the bed next to this undressed man who was very famous and had his hands like this.
I want to know who that woman was. The one she trusted. The one that she said she thought was going to protect her. But instead brought her down to a bedroom, physically put her in bed with a naked man.
We now know that Hayden Panettiere was found unresponsive in Greenville, South Carolina, and her death is now being investigated.
Hayden said a woman
she trusted took her into a tiny room on a yacht and physically placed her beside a famous, undressed man. She said she immediately realized she was in danger. There was nowhere to run. And according to Hayden, the person she believed would protect her was the very person who had led her into that room. Years later, she finally told the world what happened. And after her death, those words hit differently. For years, the world knew Hayden Panettiere as a Hollywood success story. The child star, the hero sensation, the actress, and the mother. But behind that public image was a woman who said she had spent years fighting battles most people never saw. She described growing up under enormous pressure. She described being introduced to substances by someone she trusted. She described an abusive relationship she struggled to escape. She described postpartum depression and the pain of losing control over parts of her own life. And she described something even more disturbing, a yacht encounter at 18 that left her feeling trapped and betrayed. Then, she decided to tell her story herself. Her memoir wasn't simply another celebrity book. It was Hayden attempting to take control of a narrative that she felt had been controlled by other people for most of her life. But after her sudden death, those revelations began to sound different. Because now, the questions aren't only about how Hayden lived. They're also about what happened during the final chapter of her life. Was this the tragic ending of a woman who had battled addiction and trauma for years? Or are there still details surrounding her final hours that the public doesn't know? To understand why people are asking those questions, we have to go back to the beginning. Hayden's relationship with Hollywood began when she was barely old enough to understand what a career even meant. She was auditioning as a baby. By the age of 5, she had already appeared in dozens of commercials. Television roles followed, and then came even bigger opportunities. The cameras became normal. But childhood wasn't. Hayden later explained that she missed many ordinary experiences because she was constantly attending auditions, working on sets, or traveling for her career. She learned to watch her mother's reaction after every performance. If she had done well, everything felt okay. If she hadn't, she knew the day could become very difficult. That meant Hayden wasn't simply learning how to act. She was learning how to perform for approval. And eventually, that pattern would become deeply psychological. Hayden discovered that she could cry on command. At first, it seemed simple. If she could imagine something sad, she could access the emotion and deliver the scene. But as she grew older, the emotional material became darker, and the more powerful her performances became, the harder it was to switch those emotions off.
Switch the emotion off.
Industry made me feel like now I know what kind of actor I want to be. I want to be generous and I want to be there for people, but this can also be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to read from your book, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
You say in the book that from a very young age, I lost the chance to have a normal childhood, friends, relationships, and my privacy, because instead of fighting it, I leaned into the talent I was somehow blessed with.
Hayden explains
that the emotional imagery she used to trigger tears became darker as she grew older, and eventually, she struggled to separate the character she was playing from herself. That is a disturbing lesson for a child to learn, that suffering can produce applause, that emotional pain can bring praise, and that the deeper you go into darkness, the more people may celebrate the performance. Then, Heroes changed everything. Hayden was still a teenager when Heroes turned her into a household name. The paparazzi arrived, and suddenly, strangers were following her. Photographers waited outside, constantly watching her every move. She described the experience as terrifying. The public saw a young celebrity becoming increasingly successful. Hayden experienced something very different. She felt hunted. And while her fame continued to grow, so did the expectations surrounding her. She had to look right, speak right, act right, and perform right. According to Hayden, the people around her also had enormous influence over the decisions she made. That becomes important because her relationship with substances didn't begin years later in some anonymous nightclub. According to Hayden, it began while she was still young. Hayden described being given pills before a red carpet appearance. The person who gave them to her was someone she trusted, someone who already had an established relationship with her, and someone whose job, according to Hayden, included protecting her.
As young as you did.
Yeah. And the person who handed me those pills, I had already developed a very tight relationship and a great bond with them. So when it happened, I didn't see it as anything inappropriate or negative. I trusted this person, and it was not. I didn't just have a great personal relationship with this person, but this person's job part of their job was to always protect me, and so I was so used to following the directions of the people that I respected, the people that I worked with. If they told me to jump, I jumped. If they told me to wear this, I wore that. You know, I trusted them more than I ever trusted myself.
Hayden explained
that she trusted the person who handed her the pills and didn't initially see anything inappropriate about it. She had become accustomed to following the directions of adults she respected and worked with. That is one of the most important details in Hayden's entire story, because she wasn't describing a teenager who believed she was walking into danger. She was describing a teenager who believed the people around her knew better. She said she trusted those people more than she trusted herself. That distinction would follow her for years. Then came the revelation that would become one of the darkest parts of her memoir. Hayden said she was 18 and was with someone she considered a friend, someone she believed had her back. She was led onto a boat and then downstairs into a small room, where suddenly, according to her account, the situation changed. Hayden described being physically placed beside a famous, undressed man by a woman she trusted. She said she realized she was trapped on the boat and eventually escaped, hiding because she no longer believed anyone around her would respond with empathy. The disturbing part isn't only what Hayden said happened in that room. It's who she said brought her there, a person she trusted, a person she believed was a protector, and someone she thought had her back. And that raises two questions the public has repeatedly asked. Who is the woman? And who is the famous man? The available material does not establish those identities as fact. Online speculation has attempted to connect old photographs and Hollywood social circles to Hayden's account, but speculation is not proof, and a responsible documentary has to keep that distinction clear. What we do know is what Hayden herself said she experienced. She felt shocked, she felt trapped, and she ran. That wasn't the only time Hayden described people gaining access to her life who ultimately hurt her. She later spoke about abusive relationships and described a painful cycle in which she would escape, only for the people she had tried to leave to somehow find their way back into her life. Eventually, she also described using substances to numb the pain.
Even though they would both shake their heads and say I was crazy to think there was anything similar about the two of them, there definitely was. I realized that I was more afraid of being alone than being abused. And in order to be around that kind of behavior, it took me dulling my senses and numbing myself with substances in order to silence that rational voice in my head that was telling me exactly what was going on and the many reasons why I needed to get myself out of this toxic relationship and as far away from this person as possible. Somehow, every time I found the strength to get away from my abusers, they would always find their way back into my life.
Hayden described
being more afraid of being alone than of being abused. She also spoke about using substances to numb herself and silence the part of her that knew she needed to leave. That changes the way her addiction story should be understood. Her addiction didn't exist separately from her emotional life. Instead, it became part of a larger cycle involving trauma, anxiety, fear, and repeated attempts to escape the pain. But then motherhood brought another crisis. Hayden had always wanted to become a mother. Then she had her daughter. The baby was healthy, and the moment should have been filled with pure happiness. Instead, Hayden experienced severe postpartum depression. She didn't understand what was happening. She hadn't heard the women around her openly talk about it, and she couldn't understand why she wasn't feeling the joy everyone expected her to feel.
For me, I had a wonderful pregnancy. I worked throughout my whole pregnancy, and I had a really rough birth, to the point where I almost didn't make it through.
Yes.
And then the postpartum depression started, and there I am with this beautiful, healthy, beautiful baby girl in this very fortunate life, and I could not for the life of me be happy. I was so depressed, and I just couldn't find my way out.
You wanted to be happy too. That's the thing. You were
desperately
looking forward to having the baby.
Hayden explains
that she had a difficult birth, experienced postpartum depression afterward, and felt deeply depressed despite having a healthy baby and a life she knew she was fortunate to have. The shame became part of the illness. The expectations became another burden, while alcohol and substances became ways of trying to quiet everything she was feeling inside. Eventually, her struggles affected both her career and her relationship with her daughter. But Hayden didn't simply disappear into addiction. She fought her way back and continued trying to rebuild her life. On Nashville, Hayden played Juliet Barnes. Then, the characters' storylines began to mirror Hayden's real life in unsettling ways: alcohol, troubled relationships, postpartum depression, losing a child, and addiction. Hayden said she eventually felt as if she were living through her own trauma twice, once in real life and again through the character she portrayed on
her own
screen.
trauma twice.
It felt like it never ended. I didn't know where Juliet began and Hayden ended. In the beginning, when I first started doing Nashville, I thought, well, it's just a coincidence that our lives have so many similarities. It must be. And then as the years went on, the episodes went on, and everything started matching up, from who Juliet Barnes was dating to being an alcoholic, to postpartum depression, to losing her child, basically abandoning her child.
Hayden explained that she could no longer tell where Juliet began and Hayden ended, as the show's storylines increasingly mirrored what was happening in her personal life. Imagine trying to recover from trauma while going to work every day and acting out versions of that same trauma in front of millions of people. Eventually, Hayden said the anxiety became overwhelming, and she turned to substances because she desperately needed some kind of relief.
She needed relief.
And, you're in a contract, and I became desperate, and I was doing that's why I turned to substances, because the anxiety that I started having the panic attacks that I started having. I used to have nerves a lot, and I had stage fright. I've had stage fright since I was a kid, but those good nerves that keep you on your toes at some point turned into genuine anxiety that made me incapable of functioning properly or thinking clearly. It would make me physically shake. So I was self-medicating and looking for relief at the bottom of a bottle. And it was the only thing that worked. But I needed to numb. I needed to self-numb. I needed my brain to take a trip. I needed to go on a vacation. I needed it to not think about all these ugly things for just a little while. And I didn't find myself able to do that without the help of a drink.
Hayden explained that she could no longer tell where Juliet began and Hayden ended, as the show's storylines increasingly mirrored what was happening in her personal life. Imagine trying to recover from trauma while going to work every day and acting out versions of that same trauma in front of millions of people. Eventually, Hayden said the anxiety became overwhelming, and she turned to substances because she desperately needed some kind of relief.
For years, it was an on and off battle for a really long time, and getting out of that depression was really difficult. And the fact that I didn't have the time to really spend on healing myself and fixing myself, figuring out, how to navigate this and get back to my old self, because I was on Nashville and we were shooting so much. I mean, at one point I did have to say to the show, I have to go get treatment. You're going to have to write me out of the script, which upset a lot of people and made me feel awful, because I'd always prided myself in being a professional, but it was incredibly important for me to get my head screwed on straight, or I was gonna, I was just going off the deep end. I felt myself sinking further and further and further into this dark hole that I just could not climb out of.
Hayden described years of struggling with alcoholism and depression, eventually telling the show that she needed treatment. She recalled feeling herself sink further and further into what she described as a dark hole. That was the battle nobody could see from the red carpet. Hayden wasn't simply trying to become famous again. She was trying to become herself again. For years, other people had told Hayden's story for her: paparazzi, entertainment media, headlines, and rumors. But her memoir changed the equation. For the first time, Hayden could explain what happened in her own words. She could talk about her childhood, the pressure, the pills, the abuse, the addiction, and the people who had been allowed to get too close to her. And that is why the reported timing of her death has generated so much speculation. Not because the timing proves anything, it doesn't, but because she had finally started speaking openly about the parts of her life she had spent years hiding. According to the Nancy Grace material you supplied, emergency responders were called after Hayden was reportedly found unresponsive in Greenville, South Carolina. The dispatch information reportedly referenced cardiac arrest and a possible overdose. Narcan was also reportedly administered at the scene, but none of those details, by themselves, establish an official cause or manner of death. And that's where the story becomes an investigation.
What happened? Who, what, where, when, why?
Sadly, Hayden was found unresponsive on Sunday in an apartment in Greenville, South Carolina. Paramedics, they tried to perform life-saving measures, and according to the 911 dispatch call, they found that there was some cardiac arrest and a possible overdose.
Eileen Reslin, hold on right there. Eileen joining us from Daily Mail. She is their senior showbiz exclusives reporter. Why would you say cardiac arrest, potential OD? What led them on the scene? Because if you misdiagnose on the scene and there is a chance to save the victim, you've screwed the pooch.
Eli discussed the reported cardiac arrest call, the possible overdose reference, and the report that Narcan was found at the scene. Those details naturally raised questions, but questions are not answers. Why was Narcan there? What happened before emergency responders arrived? Was an overdose actually involved? And what would toxicology eventually reveal? The supplied Nancy Grace segment also described the reported location and circumstances surrounding the incident.
This happened in Greenville, South Carolina at the Judson Mill Lofts. This is a building complex that had been a textile mill converted into apartments and living quarters that were used for Airbnb purposes. This took place on the afternoon of Sunday when a 911 call is made reporting an unresponsive woman in cardiac arrest. Responders attempted resuscitation, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. At the scene, It's been reported that there was Narcan on the bed. It was a chaotic scene. One of the neighbors said that the walls are so thin you could hear what was taking place, and there was a lot of yelling and screaming back and
Dave described the Greenville apartment complex, the emergency call, and attempts to resuscitate Hayden. He also mentioned reports of Narcan being on the bed and a chaotic scene, with a neighbor allegedly hearing yelling and screaming. But there's another critical point. At that stage, toxicology had not yet established the complete picture. And that's why Nancy repeatedly questioned the idea of simply accepting no foul play as the end of the story. The absence of obvious trauma does not automatically answer every question in a possible overdose investigation.
It's something we typically say in these types of cases. Just lets the public know that there's no obvious trauma, no obvious murder that may have occurred. But in these cases, especially overdose cases, the answer isn't present at the autopsy. And so it takes weeks to obtain toxicology results. And so therefore, in the meantime, you do your best to sort of try to provide answers while at the same time being respectful for the loved ones who are also at home waiting for those answers as well.
The autopsy itself is done on Hayden Panettiere. Mm-hmm. How long will it take me to get tox?
The medical examiner explained that toxicology can take weeks, and in suspected overdose cases, the answer may not be immediately visible from the autopsy alone. This is where conspiracy theories need to meet reality. If toxicology establishes that a substance contributed to Hayden's death, that could still leave additional questions. Where did it come from? Who supplied it? Who was around her? Could someone have prevented what happened? And was there anything in her final timeline that investigators needed to examine more closely? Those are legitimate investigative questions. But the more extreme claim that Hollywood figures intentionally killed Hayden to silence her remains a theory, not an established fact based on the material provided. And yet, the timing continues to disturb some people. Hayden spent years trying to escape the identity Hollywood had created for her. Then she wrote about the people, relationships, substances, and experiences that had shaped her life. She was finally speaking in her own voice, and then her story reportedly ended suddenly. That has led some people to ask whether her memoir made powerful people uncomfortable, whether someone around Hayden enabled her substance use, whether the addiction narrative could overshadow other possibilities, or whether the simplest explanation is also the most tragic, that years of addiction, depression, trauma, and substance use ultimately caught up with a woman who had spent years trying to recover. At this point, the evidence has to decide. Not social media, not rumors, not a thumbnail, and not a conspiracy theory, the evidence. And then there is Hayden's final interview. Perhaps the most important part was that she wasn't speaking like someone who had surrendered. She was speaking like someone who believed she was finally getting better.
Always. Still working on myself all the time. I've got a great therapist, and I'm better, healthier than I've been in a long time.
And I am cheering you on, Hayden. Well done.
Hayden says she was still working on herself, had a great therapist, and was better and healthier than she had been in a long time. Those few seconds changed the emotional weight of everything that came before. Because Hayden had spent years being defined by what went wrong: the child star, the addict, the troubled actress, the abusive relationship, the depressed mother, and the celebrity surrounded by controversy. But in that final statement, she wasn't defining herself by any of those things. She was talking about recovery. She was talking about becoming healthier. She was talking about moving forward. And then, according to the narrative presented here, she was gone. Maybe the most haunting part of Hayden Panettiere's story isn't one yacht. It isn't one relationship. It isn't one substance. And it isn't even one unanswered toxicology question. It's the pattern. A child who learned to perform for approval. A teenager who trusted the adults around her. A young woman who described betrayal by someone she believed would protect her. A mother who fought through postpartum depression. A survivor who entered treatment. And finally, a woman who decided to tell her story in her own words. At the beginning, Hayden was trying to explain what had happened to her. By the end, she was trying to show the world who she had become after surviving it. And that's what makes her final interview so painful to watch in this context. She wasn't talking about an ending. She was talking about getting better. So, the question remains, was Hayden's death the tragic final chapter of a battle she had been fighting for years? Or will investigators eventually uncover something that changes the story again? Until the evidence answers that question, we should separate what Hayden told us, what investigators establish, and what the internet chooses to believe. Because Hayden spent years fighting to reclaim her story, and perhaps the least we can do now is make sure we don't replace her truth with a theory simply because that theory is easier to believe. If Hayden's story left you with questions, tell me what stood out most. The yacht revelation, the people she trusted, her battle with addiction, or the unanswered questions surrounding her death. And if you believe her final interviews deserve to be heard in their full context, share this video so her story isn't reduced to just another headline.